The dust of El Paso, Texas, seemed to cling to everything in the summer of 1873, especially to Katherine Zimmerman's threadbare dress as she stood trembling on the auction block. Her 3-month-old son clutched desperately to her chest. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, casting harsh shadows across the town square where a crowd had gathered for the most deplorable kind of commerce. "What'll you give for this fine young woman?" the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "Healthy, strong, not yet 20 years, and the infant comes as a bonus or can be sold separately to the highest bidder." Katherine fought back tears, her blue eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. Some looked away in shame, others leered with interest, but none showed the compassion she desperately sought. 3 months ago, she'd been a respectable woman with dreams of a future. Now, after the death of her husband and the foreclosure of their small homestead, her creditors had forced her into this horrific position. "Please," she whispered, though no one could hear her, "please don't separate us." At the back of the crowd, Weston Abernathy adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, his jaw tightening as he watched the scene unfold. At 30, the rancher had seen his fair share of ugliness on the frontier, but the sight of a mother and child on the auction block stirred something fierce in him. "$5, someone called out. "10 for just the woman." Another voice added, "15 for the baby." This last bid came from a portly man in a fine suit, who Katherine recognized as Mr. Hollister, a man known for buying children to work in his factory. Katherine clutched her son tighter, her breathing shallow with panic. The baby, sensing his mother's distress, began to whimper. "I'll give you $300 for both of them," a deep voice cut through the commotion. The crowd parted as Weston stepped forward, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. He stood tall among the onlookers, his weathered face impassive beneath his hat, but his eyes burned with conviction. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $300, going once. "And," Weston continued, his voice steady, "I'm buying their freedom." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer hesitated, looking to Katherine's creditors who stood at the side of the platform. "The debt is $285, one of them said. "If the gentleman wants to pay it, plus our fee, I suppose we have no objection." "Going twice. Sold to the cowboy in the back," the auctioneer declared, pounding his gavel. Katherine couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her legs nearly gave way beneath her as Weston approached the platform, counted out the money, and handed it to the creditors. He then turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Madam," he said, extending his hand to help her down from the platform. "You and your son are free to go wherever you please." Katherine stared at him, unable to comprehend this sudden turn of events. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "No one should own another person," Weston replied simply, "and no child should be separated from his mother." As they walked away from the auction block, the whispers of the crowd followed them. Katherine held her son close, her mind racing with questions and fears. "I don't understand, Mr. Abernathy." "Weston Abernathy," he supplied. "I own the Triple Ranch about 10 miles outside of town." "Mr. Abernathy," Katherine continued, "I'm grateful beyond words, but I have nothing to repay you with." Weston stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "I didn't do this for repayment, Miss Zimmerman, Katherine Zimmerman, and this is Jacob," she said, nodding to her son. "Miss Zimmerman, I did what any decent man should do. Now, do you have somewhere to go? Family nearby?" Katherine's gaze dropped to the dusty street. "No, sir. My husband died 3 months ago, just after Jacob was born. We had no family in these parts." Weston considered this information, his brow furrowed in thought. "I can't in good conscience leave you and your boy with no shelter or provisions." He hesitated, then continued, "My ranch has a small cabin for workers. It's vacant now. You're welcome to stay there until you decide what you want to do next." Katherine looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives, but found only earnest concern. "Why would you help a stranger this way?" she asked, still wary despite her desperate situation. "Because 8 years ago, I was in a place nearly as bad as yours," Weston replied quietly. "Someone offered me a chance when I needed it most. I'm simply doing the same." Katherine looked down at Jacob, who had settled into sleep against her chest, unaware of how close they had come to being separated forever. The thought of having a safe place to sleep tonight, somewhere to gather her thoughts and plan her next steps, was overwhelming. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said finally. "We accept your offer, at least for tonight." Weston nodded, a hint of relief crossing his features. "My wagon is this way," he said, gesturing down the street. "We should get going if we want to reach the ranch before nightfall." As they walked toward Weston's wagon, Katherine felt the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. Her future was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she and Jacob would be safe, and for now, that was enough. The journey to the Triple, a ranch, passed largely in silence. Katherine sat beside Weston on the wagon bench, her son sleeping in her arms as they traveled through the rugged Texas landscape. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scrubby plains, and a hot breeze occasionally stirred the dust around them. "What brought you to El Paso?" Weston finally asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Katherine adjusted Jacob in her arms before answering. "My husband, Thomas, had dreams of starting a horse breeding operation. We came from Missouri 2 years ago with everything we owned." She paused, swallowing hard. "He worked as a blacksmith in town while we saved to buy more land. Then there was an accident at the forge." Weston nodded solemnly, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Zimmerman." "Thank you," Katherine replied quietly. "After Thomas died, I tried to keep up with the payments on our small homestead, but—" Her voice trailed off. "The creditors were not patient men." "Few are in these parts," Weston agreed grimly. "They gave me 3 months to settle the debt," Katherine continued. "When I couldn't, they took everything, the land, our few possessions, and then—" She looked down at Jacob. "They said we were the final payment." Weston's hands tightened on the reins. "That's not legal, even out here." "Perhaps not," Katherine said with a bitter edge to her voice, "but who would stop them?" The marshal seemed to look the other way. They fell back into silence as the wagon crested a small rise, revealing the Triple, a ranch spread out before them. It wasn't the largest ranch Katherine had seen, but it was clearly well maintained. A main house stood in the center, with several outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse arranged around it. Beyond these structures stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the distance. "It's not much compared to some of the bigger spreads," Weston said, noticing her gaze, "but it's mine, free and clear." "It's beautiful," Katherine said honestly as they approached the main house. A tall, gray-haired man emerged onto the porch. He raised his hand in greeting before walking toward the wagon. "That's Cecil," Weston explained. "He's been with me since I started this place. Foreman, cook, and sometimes the voice of reason." Cecil reached the wagon as Weston pulled the horses to a stop. His weathered face registered surprise at the sight of Katherine and the baby. "Didn't expect you back with company, boss," he said, his keen eyes taking in the situation. "Cecil, this is Mrs. Katherine Zimmerman and her son Jacob," Weston said. "They'll be staying in the workers' cabin for a while." If Cecil had questions, he kept them to himself, simply nodding and offering Katherine a respectful tip of his hat. "Madam, little one, welcome to AAA." "Thank you," Katherine replied, her voice betraying her exhaustion. "The cabin's not been used in a while," Cecil said, turning to Weston. "Might need some airing out." "We'll see to it," Weston assured him. "Is there any of that stew left from yesterday?" "Plenty," Cecil confirmed. "I'll heat some up." Weston helped Katherine down from the wagon, then led her toward a small cabin set slightly apart from the other buildings. It was a simple structure with a porch across the front, and smoke-stained stones forming the chimney at one end. "It's basic," Weston said as he pushed open the door, "but solid." The interior consisted of a main room with a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against one wall. A curtained-off area presumably contained another sleeping space. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late-afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "This will be more than adequate," Katherine assured him, relief evident in her voice at the sight of the cabin. After months of uncertainty and the horror of the auction block, even this modest shelter seemed like a luxury. Weston nodded, looking somewhat relieved. "I'll bring in some fresh water and linens. Cecil will be over with food shortly." Left alone in the cabin, Katherine sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself a moment to process the day's events. Jacob stirred in her arms, his tiny face scrunching as he woke. She rocked him gently, whispering reassurances. "We're safe now, little one," she murmured, though she wasn't entirely convinced of it herself. After all, she was now completely dependent on the goodwill of a man she had just met. But something about Weston Abernathy's straightforward manner and clear eyes made her want to trust him. There was a knock at the door, and Cecil entered carrying a tray with 2 bowls of stew, a plate of cornbread, and a pot of coffee. Behind him came Weston with a bucket of water and a stack of linens. "Thought you might be hungry, madam," Cecil said, setting the tray on the table. "Thank you, just Cecil, madam. Everyone calls me Cecil," Katherine nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Cecil. I am quite hungry." Weston set down the water and linens. "There's a cradle in the storage shed. I'll clean it up and bring it over." "A cradle?" Katherine asked, surprised. A shadow crossed Weston's face. "It was made for someone who never arrived. It should serve your boy well enough." Before Katherine could inquire further, Weston turned and left the cabin. Cecil gave her a sympathetic look. "The boss has had his share of hardships," the older man said cryptically. "He doesn't talk about it much." He gestured to the food. "You should eat while it's hot, madam. Growing boy there needs his mama well fed." After Cecil departed, Katherine ate the stew hungrily, realizing she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Jacob nursed contentedly afterward, and by the time Weston returned with a beautifully crafted wooden cradle, both mother and child were beginning to settle from the day's turmoil. Weston set the cradle near the bed and nodded toward a small chest he'd also brought. "There are some extra blankets in there and a few other necessities. The nights can get cool, even in summer." "Mr. Abernathy," Katherine began, "I don't know how to thank you properly." "You don't need to," he interrupted gently. "Get some rest, Mrs. Zimmerman. Tomorrow is soon enough to discuss what comes next." As he turned to leave, Katherine called after him, "Please call me Katherine." Weston paused at the door, his expression softening slightly. "Good night, Katherine. Sleep well." After he left, Katherine placed Jacob in the cradle and watched him settle into sleep. The events of the day had been so overwhelming that she could scarcely believe they were real. Just this morning, she had resigned herself to the worst possible fate, and now she was safe in this small cabin, her son beside her. As exhaustion overtook her, Katherine's last thought before drifting to sleep was of the enigmatic cowboy who had changed their fate with a single act of kindness. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the distant sounds of ranch life already in motion. Katherine woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until her eyes fell on Jacob sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside her bed. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and with them, a mixture of relief and uncertainty about what would happen next. She rose quietly, not wanting to wake Jacob, and went to the small wash basin that had been provided. After washing her face and doing her best to make herself presentable in her travel-worn dress, she stepped onto the cabin's small porch. The triple-A ranch looked different in the clear morning light. What had seemed modest in the evening now revealed itself to be a well-organized operation. Several cowboys were already at work in the corrals, and smoke rose from the chimney of what appeared to be a cookhouse. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the rolling plains. "Morning, madam," called a voice, and Katherine turned to see Cecil approaching with a tray. "Brought you some breakfast. Thought you might not be ready to join the others just yet." "That's very kind, thank you," Katherine replied, genuinely touched by the consideration. Cecil set the tray on a small table on the porch. "Coffee, eggs, biscuits. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going." "It looks wonderful," Katherine assured him. "Is Mr. Abernathy about? I'd like to speak with him." "Boss rode out early with some of the men," Cecil explained. "One of the streams that waters the south pasture got blocked up. He should be back by midday." He hesitated, then added, "He asked me to tell you to make yourself at home, and that there's no rush for you to decide anything." Katherine nodded, both relieved and disappointed by Weston's absence. Part of her was grateful for the time to gather her thoughts, but another part was eager to discuss what would happen next. "Is there anything I can do to help around here?" she asked. "I'm not one to sit idle, especially when I'm accepting charity." Cecil's weathered face creased in a smile. "Not charity, madam, just neighborliness. But if you're set on helping, the garden behind the cookhouse could use some tending. No one here has much of a touch with vegetables." "I'd be happy to look at it," Katherine said, relieved to have a purpose for the day. After finishing her breakfast and feeding Jacob, Katherine wrapped her son in a sling across her chest and made her way to the garden Cecil had mentioned. It was indeed in need of attention. Weeds threatened to overtake the vegetables, and many plants looked water-starved despite the nearby well. Katherine set to work immediately, finding solace in the familiar task. She had maintained a small kitchen garden at her own homestead and knew how to coax life from the challenging Texas soil. As she worked, Jacob slept contentedly in his sling, occasionally waking to nurse before drifting off again. The morning passed quickly as Katherine lost herself in the work. Several of the ranch hands passed by, tipping their hats respectfully but keeping their distance. She appreciated their discretion, aware that her presence was unusual and likely the subject of speculation. Around midday, as the sun reached its zenith, Katherine heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up from her weeding, she saw Weston returning with 3 other men. They rode directly to the stables, dismounting and leading their horses inside. Katherine continued her work, uncertain whether to seek Weston out or wait for him to approach her. The decision was made for her when, about 20 minutes later, his shadow fell across the garden plot. "You've been busy," he observed, looking at the neat rows she had reclaimed from the weeds. Katherine straightened, wiping dirt from her hands onto her skirt. "I wanted to make myself useful." Weston nodded approvingly. "Cecil mentioned you were asking after me this morning." "Yes," Katherine confirmed, suddenly finding it difficult to articulate her thoughts. I wanted to thank you again and to discuss what happens next." Weston gestured to a bench at the edge of the garden. "Shall we sit?" Once they were seated, with Jacob still sleeping peacefully in his sling, Weston spoke first. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, Katherine. There's no hurry for you to leave. That's very generous, Katherine replied, but I can't impose indefinitely. I need to find work to support myself and Jacob. Weston considered her words. What skills do you have? I can cook, so garden, obviously. She gestured to the rows of vegetables. I kept the books for my husband's blacksmith shop. I can read and write well enough. Those are valuable skills, Weston acknowledged. As it happens, we're in need of someone to manage the household. Cecil does his best, but he's stretched thin between his duties as foreman and trying to keep the place in order. Katherine studied him, trying to determine if this was a genuine offer or merely charity disguised as employment. Are you offering me a position, Mr. Abernathy? Weston, please, he corrected. And yes, I am. Room and board for you and your son, plus wages. The cabin would be yours for as long as you work here. And what exactly would my duties entail? Katherine asked, still cautious. Cooking for the main house, managing supplies, keeping the accounts in order, Weston listed. The men eat at the cookhouse, so you wouldn't need to feed the whole crew, just me and occasionally Cecil or visitors. It was a fair offer, better than Katherine had dared hope for, yet something still troubled her. May I ask why you're doing this? First buying our freedom, now offering employment. It's more kindness than most would show a stranger. Weston's gaze shifted to the distant horizon. 8 years ago, I was broke and desperate, running from a past I wasn't proud of. A man named Abernathy gave me work when no one else would. He later adopted me, gave me his name, and eventually left me this ranch. His eyes returned to Katherine. I'm not a particularly religious man, but I believe in paying forward what's been given to you. The sincerity in his voice convinced Katherine more than his words. She looked down at Jacob, considering what this would mean for her son's future. I accept your offer, she said finally, but on one condition, that you'll be honest with me if my work isn't satisfactory. I don't want position out of pity. A rare smile crossed Weston's face. Mrs. Zimmerman, you've done more for that garden in one morning than anyone has managed in months. I have no concerns about your abilities. He extended his hand. Do we have an agreement? Katherine shook his hand, his calloused palm warm against her own soil-stained fingers. We do. And please call me Katherine. Katherine, he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart skip a beat. She quickly attributed it to relief at securing their future, nothing more. I'll start tomorrow, she promised. Weston nodded, rising from the bench. Cecil will show you the main house and where everything is kept. For now, though, you might want to get out of this midday sun. It's fierce today. As Katherine watched him walk away, she felt a strange mixture of emotions, gratitude, relief, but also something else she couldn't quite name. Whatever it was, she pushed it aside. Her focus needed to be on establishing security for herself and Jacob. Anything else was a luxury she couldn't afford. The days that followed established a rhythm to Katherine's new life at the Triple A Ranch. She rose early each morning, tended to Jacob, and then made her way to the main house to prepare breakfast for Weston before he rode out with his men. The house itself was larger than the cabin but simply furnished, with a spacious kitchen that became Katherine's domain. After breakfast, she would work through a list of tasks, keeping the house in order, managing the pantry, recording expenses and cattle sales in the ranch ledgers. In the afternoons, she often returned to the garden, which flourished under her care. Jacob stayed with her throughout the day, sleeping in a basket she kept nearby or exploring the world from his sling. Weston himself remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, appreciative of her cooking and the improvements she made to the house, but he maintained a certain distance. Their conversations rarely ventured beyond the business of the ranch or practical matters. Yet Katherine occasionally caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, a thoughtful expression on his face that made her wonder what he was thinking. 2 weeks after her arrival, Katherine was preparing supper when she heard raised voices outside. Curious, she moved to the window to see Weston confronting a well-dressed man on horseback. Even from a distance, she could tell the conversation was tense. The stranger eventually rode away, and Weston stood watching him go, his posture rigid with what looked like anger. When he turned toward the house, Katherine quickly returned to her cooking, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. Weston entered the kitchen a few minutes later, his expression stormy. "Is everything all right?" Katherine ventured, setting a cup of coffee before him. He took the cup with a nod of thanks. "That was Howard Blackwood, owner of the Double B Ranch to the east. He's been trying to buy this land for years." "And you don't want to sell?" Katherine asked, though the answer was obvious. Weston's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "This ranch is all I have. Blackwood knows that, but he keeps pushing. He's not used to hearing no." "He sounds unpleasant," Katherine remarked, turning back to the stove. "He's dangerous," Weston corrected her. "Be wary if you ever encounter him in town." The seriousness in his tone made Katherine look up in surprise. "Is there bad blood between you?" Weston hesitated, then sighed. "Blackwood had a son, Peter. He and we had a disagreement a few years back. It ended badly." Katherine sensed there was more to the story, but Weston's closed expression made it clear he wasn't willing to elaborate further. She returned to her cooking, filing the information away. "Supper will be ready soon," she said, changing the subject. "I made stew with some of those vegetables from the garden." "It smells good," Weston acknowledged, his mood lightening slightly. "Cecil says you're a miracle worker with those plants." "Hardly a miracle," Katherine demurred, "just patience and attention." As they ate supper together, as had become their custom, Katherine found herself studying Weston's face in the lamplight. At 30, the lines around his eyes spoke of hardship and responsibility taken on young. Yet there was a quiet strength in his features that she found herself admiring. "You're staring, Katherine," Weston observed without looking up from his plate. Heat rushed to her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I was just thinking." "About what?" Katherine hesitated, then decided on honesty. "About how little I know about you despite living on your land for 2 weeks now." Weston set down his fork, considering her words. "What would you like to know?" "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Before Texas." "Kentucky," he replied after a moment. "Left when I was 16, drifted for a few years before ending up here." "And your family?" A shadow crossed his face. "Dead, father in the war, mother from fever the year after." "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. Weston shrugged, though the gesture couldn't disguise the old pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago. And you never married." The question slipped out before Katherine could consider its propriety. Weston's gaze met hers directly, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Almost," he said simply. "It didn't work out." Before Katherine could respond, Jacob began to cry from his basket nearby. She rose quickly to attend to him, grateful for the interruption that hit her flushed cheeks. By the time she had soothed her son, the moment of unexpected intimacy had passed, and Weston had returned to his usual reserved demeanor. That night, as Katherine lay in bed in the cabin, Jacob sleeping soundly in his cradle, she found herself thinking about Weston more than she should. There was something about him that drew her, despite her determination to remain focused solely on securing her and Jacob's future. Perhaps it was the kindness beneath his gruff exterior, or the way his rare smiles transformed his face. "Don't be a fool, Katherine," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "The man gave you charity, then employment. That doesn't mean anything more. Yet as she drifted off to sleep, it was Weston's face that lingered in her mind, and the memory of his eyes when they had met hers across the table. The next few weeks brought changes to the Triple Ranch. With autumn approaching, preparations began for the cattle drive that would take a portion of the herd to market in Fort Worth. The ranch became busier, with cowboys preparing equipment and Weston often returning late from long days in the saddle. Katherine found her duties expanding naturally. Beyond managing the household, she began helping Cecil with supply orders and payroll, her neat handwriting and head for figures proving invaluable. Her garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables for the ranch table, and she even began teaching Jacob simple words. Though at 6 months old, he was more interested in chewing his wooden blocks than naming them. One evening in late September, as Katherine was hanging laundry behind the cabin, she noticed a rider approaching from the east. It wasn't Weston or any of the ranch hands she recognized. She gathered Jacob from his blanket on the ground and retreated toward the cabin, suddenly wary. The rider, a well-dressed man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed beard, pulled his horse to a stop when he saw her. "Good afternoon, madam," he called, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for Weston Abernathy." "Mr. Abernathy is checking the north pasture," Katherine replied cautiously. "He should return before sundown. May I tell him who called?" The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her. "Howard Blackwood," he said, and Katherine immediately recognized the name from Weston's warning. "And you are, Mrs. Zimmerman," she replied, deliberately using her married title as a shield. "I manage the household." "Indeed." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Abernathy hasn't mentioned taking on new staff or acquiring a child." The way he looked at Jacob made Katherine's arms tighten protectively around her son. "Mr. Abernathy is a private man. Would you like to leave a message for him?" "Just tell him I stopped by," Blackwood said, his gaze lingering uncomfortably on Katherine. "Tell him I'm still interested in discussing business." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, but not before Katherine caught the calculating look in his eyes. She hurried into the cabin, bolting the door behind her despite the early hour. Something about Blackwood had chilled her to the bone. When Weston returned at dusk, Katherine was waiting on the porch of the main house, Jacob asleep in her arms. "Blackwood was here," she said without preamble as Weston dismounted. His head snapped up, concern evident in his expression. "Did he bother you?" "No," Katherine assured him. "He was looking for you, said to tell you he's still interested in discussing business." Weston's jaw tightened. "Did he say anything else?" Katherine hesitated, then decided to be forthright. "He seemed surprised by my presence and Jacob's. The way he looked at us made me uncomfortable." Weston stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Katherine, Blackwood is not a man to be taken lightly. He uses people's weaknesses against them. And you think he sees me as your weakness?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was ready to address. "I think he sees you as someone under my protection," Weston said carefully. "That's enough for him to take an interest." Katherine nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. "Should I be concerned?" "Just be vigilant," Weston advised. "Don't go far from the ranch buildings alone, and if you see him again, find me or Cecil immediately." As they stood on the porch in the fading light, Jacob stirred in Katherine's arms, reaching out a tiny hand toward Weston. Without hesitation, Weston offered his finger, which Jacob promptly grabbed with surprising strength. "He's getting stronger," Weston observed, a rare smile softening his features. "Yes," Katherine agreed, watching the interaction with a warm feeling spreading through her chest. "He's thriving here." Their eyes met over Jacob's head, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the fragile connection that was growing despite their efforts to maintain professional distance. The moment was broken by Cecil calling from the bunkhouse, requesting Weston's input on the drive preparations. With a nod to Katherine, Weston gently extracted his finger from Jacob's grip and strode away, leaving her with a jumble of emotions she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The cattle drive was scheduled to depart in 3 days. Weston would lead it himself, taking half the ranch hands and leaving Cecil to manage the triple in his absence. As the departure approached, Katherine found herself increasingly anxious about Weston leaving, though she tried to hide it. The evening before the drive, after supper had been cleared away, Weston lingered at the table while Katherine put Jacob down for the night in a basket she kept in the kitchen. "I should be gone about 3 weeks," Weston said, watching as she tucked a small blanket around her sleeping son. "Cecil knows how to reach me if there's trouble." "We'll be fine," Katherine assured him, though her voice lacked conviction. Weston studied her face in the lamplight. "I've been thinking about Blackwood," he said finally. "It might be safer if you and Jacob moved into the main house while I'm gone. There's a bedroom off the kitchen that's never used." Katherine's first instinct was to decline moving into Weston's house, even temporarily, seemed to cross a boundary they had tacitly established. But practicality won out over propriety. The cabin was isolated, and with fewer men on the ranch, it would be more vulnerable. "If you think it's best," she agreed, "just until you return." Weston nodded, looking relieved. "Cecil will help you move your things tomorrow." A silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Katherine busied herself with wiping down the table, aware of Weston's eyes following her movements. "Katherine," he said suddenly, his voice lower than usual, "there's something I should tell you before I leave." She looked up, her heart inexplicably racing at his tone. "Yes." Weston seemed to struggle with his words, unusual for a man typically so direct. "If anything should happen while I'm gone, if Blackwood causes trouble, there's a strongbox in my desk. The key is under the loose floorboard by the fireplace. Inside is enough money to get you and Jacob to San Francisco, and a letter to a friend there who would help you." Katherine stared at him, stunned by the implications. "You think it could come to that?" "I think it's best to be prepared," Weston replied grimly. "Blackwood has been pressing harder lately. He wants this land, and he's not above using underhanded methods to get it." "What aren't you telling me about him?" Katherine asked, sensing there was more to the story than Weston had shared. Weston sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "His son, Peter. The disagreement I mentioned, it was over a woman. Peter was mistreating her and I intervened. There was a fight. Peter drew his gun, but he was drunk and slow. I wasn't." His eyes met Katherine's, unflinching. "I killed him, Katherine. It was ruled self-defense, but Howard Blackwood has never accepted that. He wants revenge, and he wants this land, the land his son would have inherited if he'd married the woman he was courting." The revelation hung heavy in the kitchen. Katherine absorbed the information, seeing Weston in a new light, not just as her benefactor, but as a man with a past as complicated as her own. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, "for trusting me with the truth." Weston nodded, his expression guarded as he waited for her judgment. "We all have things in our past we wish had happened differently," Katherine continued softly. "What matters is how we choose to live now." Something in Weston's face relaxed at her words, as if a burden had been partially lifted. He rose from the table, moving toward the door, but paused beside Katherine. Hesitantly, he raised a hand and gently touched her cheek, the briefest contact that nonetheless sent warmth flooding through her. "Take care of yourself and the boy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll return as soon as I can." Before Katherine could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. She remained standing in the kitchen, her cheek still warm from his touch, her heart racing with feelings she could no longer deny. The cattle drive departed at dawn the next morning. Katherine watched from the porch of the main house, Jacob in her arms, as Weston led his men and the herd eastward. He paused at the crest of a small rise, turning in his saddle to look back at the ranch at her. She raised her hand in farewell, and he tipped his hat before disappearing over the ridge. Katherine settled into the bedroom off the kitchen that day, arranging her few possessions and Jacob's cradle. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a window that looked out toward the garden she had reclaimed. It felt strange to be living in Weston's house, surrounded by his belongings, sleeping under his roof while he was miles away. The first few days after the drive's departure passed uneventfully. Katherine maintained her usual routine, working in the garden, keeping the house in order, and helping Cecil with the ranch accounts. The remaining cowboys kept to themselves in the bunkhouse, respectfully tipping their hats whenever they encountered her. On the fourth day, Katherine was hanging laundry when she noticed dust rising on the horizon riders approaching from the east. Cecil appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, and instructed her to take Jacob into the house. Through the window, Katherine watched as Howard Blackwood and two men rode into the yard. They spoke with Cecil for several minutes, their conversation appearing tense but not hostile. Eventually, they rode away and Cecil came to the house to report. "Blackwood's asking after water rights again," Cecil explained, his weathered face creased with worry. "Claims the stream that runs through both properties is being diverted unfairly." "Is it?" Katherine asked. Cecil shook his head. "No, madam. It's just an excuse to cause trouble while the boss is away. I told him any such discussions would have to wait for Mr. Abernathy's return." That night, Katherine found it difficult to sleep. She kept thinking about Blackwood's visit and Weston's warnings. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to Jacob's soft breathing from his cradle, she couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was brewing. Her instincts proved correct. The next morning, Cecil rode in from checking the eastern boundary with troubling news someone had cut a section of fence, allowing a dozen triple cattle to wander onto Blackwood's property. It was deliberate, Cecil fumed as Katherine poured him coffee in the kitchen. "Clean cuts, not broken by animals. Blackwood's playing games, testing our response." "What will you do?" Katherine asked, concern evident in her voice. "Ride over there and demand our cattle back," Cecil replied grimly. "Can't let this stand or it'll just escalate." "Is that safe, going alone?" Cecil's expression softened at her worry. "I'll take 2 men with me. We'll be careful, just state our business and retrieve what's ours." After Cecil and the men departed, Katherine tried to focus on her chores, but anxiety kept her returning to the window, watching for their return. Jacob seemed to sense her unease, fussing more than usual until she finally settled in the rocking chair with him, singing softly to soothe them both. It was nearly sunset when Cecil returned, his face grim. The men with him looked equally troubled as they led their horses to the stable. "What happened?" Katherine asked when Cecil entered the kitchen. "Blackwood claims he hasn't seen our cattle," Cecil reported, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Says if they wandered onto his land, his men must have assumed they were strays and driven them to market with their own herd yesterday." "He's lying," Katherine stated, not a question but a certainty. "Of course he is," Cecil agreed, "but without proof there's little we can do. And his men outnumber us while the drive's away." That night, after Jacob was asleep, Katherine found herself drawn to Weston's study. The room was austere but comfortable, with a large desk, bookshelves, and a worn leather armchair. It smelled of tobacco and leather, distinctly masculine, distinctly Weston. She ran her fingers along the spines of his book's histories, practical guides to ranching, a few novels. On his desk sat a framed photograph of an older couple, presumably the Abernathys who had taken him in and given him their name and legacy. Katherine thought about the strongbox Weston had mentioned, the escape route he had prepared for her and Jacob. The fact that he had considered their safety so carefully touched her deeply. In the short time they had known each other, he had shown more concern for her well-being than anyone since Thomas died. As she stood in Weston's study, surrounded by the evidence of his life, Katherine admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny: she was falling in love with him. It had happened gradually, through 100 small moments: his gentleness with Jacob, his quiet strength, the integrity that guided his actions. Even his revelation about Peter Blackwood's death had only deepened her respect for him, showing his willingness to stand against injustice despite the cost. But did he feel anything similar for her? His touch before leaving, the concern in his eyes, these suggested he cared. But to what extent? Katherine had no illusions about her situation. A widow with a child, dependent on his charity-turned-employment, she was hardly in a position to entertain romantic notions about her employer. With a sigh, Katherine left the study, closing the door quietly behind her. Whatever her feelings, they would have to wait. For now, the priority was keeping Jacob safe and protecting the ranch until Weston returned. The next week brought escalating tensions with the Double B Ranch. 2 more sections of fence were cut. A watering hole used by Triple A cattle was found contaminated, and twice riders from Blackwood's ranch were spotted surveying Triple A land under the pretext of checking boundary markers. Cecil grew increasingly concerned, especially when one of their hands reported seeing strangers in town asking questions about the Triple A's defenses while Weston was away. "He's planning something," Cecil told Katherine as they sat at the kitchen table after supper, going over the ranch accounts. "Blackwood's never been this bold before." "Could we send word to Weston?" Katherine suggested. "Ask him to return early." Cecil shook his head. "The drive will be in Fort Worth by now. Even if we could get a message to him, it would take him at least a week to get back. By then." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. They both understood that Blackwood might not wait that long to make his move, whatever it was. That night, Katherine checked the loose floorboard by the fireplace, confirming the key was there as Weston had said. She didn't take it not yet, but knowing it was available provided some small comfort. 2 days later, that comfort proved necessary. Katherine was in the garden, harvesting late vegetables with Jacob nearby in his basket, when she heard the thunder of approaching hooves. Looking up, she saw at least a dozen riders approaching fast from the east, too many to be their own men returning, and coming from the direction of Blackwood's ranch. Cecil burst from the barn, shouting for her to get inside the house. Katherine scooped up Jacob and ran, heart pounding as the first shots rang out behind her. She made it to the house, bolting the door behind her as Cecil and the remaining ranch hands took up defensive positions. Through the window, she could see Blackwood himself among the riders, directing his men as they surrounded the main house and outbuildings. "Mrs. Zimmerman," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly. "I know you're in there. Send out Cecil and we can discuss this situation civilly." Katherine held Jacob close, his small body tense with her own fear. She moved away from the window, retreating to the kitchen where Cecil had entered through the back door, his rifle ready. "Don't answer him," Cecil advised grimly. "He's looking for any excuse. What does he want?" Katherine whispered. "The ranch," Cecil replied simply. "With Weston gone and us outnumbered, he thinks he can take it by force and claim it was due to some manufactured dispute. More shots rang out, shattering a window in the front room. Jacob began to cry, and Katherine rocked him desperately, trying to soothe him while her own heart raced with fear. "The strong box," she said suddenly. "Weston told me about it, about the money and the letter to his friend in San Francisco." Cecil looked at her sharply. "He told you about that?" Katherine nodded. "He said if Blackwood caused trouble while he was gone." Understanding dawned in Cecil's eyes. "Go," he said firmly. "Get the key and the box. There's a back trail through the hills that Blackwood's men won't know about. I can get you to the station at Stockton, 20 miles west." "But the ranch can be reclaimed," Cecil interrupted. "Buildings rebuilt, but you and that boy need to be safe. That's what Weston would want." Katherine knew he was right. As much as it pained her to flee, Jacob's safety had to come first. She hurried to the study, retrieving the key from under the floorboard and unlocking the strong box in Weston's desk. Inside, as promised, was a substantial sum of money and a sealed letter addressed to someone named James Morgan in San Francisco. As she gathered the items, along with a few essential possessions and supplies for Jacob, the sounds of conflict outside intensified. Blackwood's men had set fire to one of the outbuildings, and smoke was beginning to drift toward the main house. Cecil appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "We need to go now, through the root cellar. I've saddled 2 horses and left them by the back fence." Katherine nodded, securing the money and letter inside her bodice and wrapping Jacob tightly against her chest in his sling. With a last glance around the house that had briefly been her home, she followed Cecil down to the cellar and through a narrow tunnel that led beyond the house's foundation. They emerged some distance from the main buildings, the sounds of shouting and gunfire partially muffled by distance. True to his word, Cecil had 2 horses waiting, already saddled and supplied with basic provisions. "Head west along the creek bed," Cecil instructed as he helped her mount. "It'll keep you hidden until you reach the hills. The trail to Stockton splits at the old lightning-struck oak. Take the left fork. It's longer but safer." "What about you?" Katherine asked, seeing he was preparing to return to the house. "I'll hold them off as long as I can, give you time to get clear," Cecil replied grimly. "Then I'll find Weston and bring him back." "Cecil," Katherine began, her voice choked with emotion. The old foreman shook his head. "No time for that now. Go, Mrs. Zimmerman. Keep that boy safe." With a final nod of gratitude, Katherine urged her horse forward, following the creek bed as instructed. Jacob, mercifully, had quieted against her chest, lulled by the motion of the horse. As they rode away from the AAA, Katherine could see smoke rising from more than one building now, and the occasional crack of gunfire still split the air. Tears streamed down her face as she rode, grief and fear mingling with determination. She had lost another home, but she still had Jacob. And somewhere, Weston was alive, unaware of what was happening. She prayed Cecil would reach him safely, that they would both survive Blackwood's attack. As the AAA ranch disappeared from view behind her, Katherine set her sights westward. Stockton first, then San Francisco. She would follow Weston's contingency plan, find this James Morgan, and wait. Because despite the danger and distance, despite the uncertainty of the future, something deep inside told her that this was not the end of her story with Weston Abernathy, but merely a painful chapter in a tale still unfolding. The journey to Stockton was grueling. Katherine rode through the night, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the horse or attend to Jacob's needs. The terrain was rough, the trail sometimes barely visible in the darkness, but Cecil's directions proved accurate. By dawn, she had reached the hills that would shield her approach to Stockton. Jacob was remarkably resilient, sleeping against her chest for much of the journey and waking only to nurse, or when the horse's gait became particularly jarring. Katherine spoke to him constantly, soft reassurances that helped steady her own nerves as much as soothe her son. "We'll be all right, little one," she murmured as they paused by a stream to rest. "We're strong, you and Weston will find us. I'm certain of it." By mid-afternoon, the small town of Stockton came into view, a cluster of buildings surrounding a train station, nestled in a valley between rolling hills. Katherine approached cautiously, wary of Blackwood's men possibly searching for her. She skirted the town's edge, making her way directly to the station. The station master, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up in surprise as Katherine entered with Jacob in her arms, her dress dusty from the trail and her face showing the strain of the journey. "Madam, are you all right?" he asked, rising from his desk. "When is the next train west?" Katherine asked, not wanting to waste time on explanations. "There's one due at 4 o'clock, the station master replied, checking his pocket watch. "About an hour from now. Goes as far as Tucson, though." "I need to reach San Francisco," Katherine said, reaching for the money hidden in her bodice. "How far can I get with this train?" "You'd need to change at Tucson, then again at Yuma," the station master explained. "From there, the Southern Pacific can take you to Los Angeles and then north to San Francisco. Take about 5 days total if the connections are good." Katherine nodded, counting out the money for the ticket. "One adult to Tucson, then." As the station master prepared her ticket, Katherine glanced nervously out the window, half expecting to see Blackwood's men riding into town. The station was quiet, however, with only a few travelers waiting on the platform. "Here you are, Mrs." The station master paused, waiting for her name. Katherine hesitated, then made a split-second decision. "Abernathy," she said firmly. "Mrs. Weston Abernathy." Using Weston's name might offer some protection if Blackwood's men came looking for a Mrs. Zimmerman. It was deceptive, but under the circumstances, Katherine felt the precaution was justified. The station master handed over the ticket without comment, though his eyes lingered briefly on her lack of a wedding ring. "Train should be here shortly, Mrs. Abernathy. There's a waiting room through there if you'd like to rest before boarding." The waiting room was empty, allowing Katherine a moment of privacy to tend to Jacob and gather her thoughts. As she sat on the hard wooden bench, feeding her son and watching the clock tick closer to departure time, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the span of just a few months. From the desperation of the auction block to the relative security of the AAA, and now to this flight toward an uncertain future, it seemed her life was a series of forced departures and new beginnings. Yet this time was different. This time, she wasn't just running from danger, but toward the possibility of reunion with Weston. The train arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, its whistle piercing the quiet afternoon. Katherine boarded quickly, finding a seat in a relatively empty car. As the train pulled away from Stockton, she watched the landscape slide past, wondering if she would ever see the AAA ranch again, or if Weston was even now riding toward a home that might no longer exist. The journey west was long and difficult with an infant, but Katherine managed as best she could. Fellow passengers occasionally offered assistance, an older woman who held Jacob while Katherine used the washroom, a kindly conductor who brought her extra water for the baby. At each transfer point, Katherine listened carefully for any news from the direction of El Paso, but heard nothing about the conflict between the ranches. 5 days after leaving Stockton, Katherine arrived in San Francisco, a city unlike any she had seen before. Built on hills overlooking a magnificent bay, it bustled with energy and commerce. a sharp contrast to the rural Texas landscape she had left behind. With Jacob secured in his sling, Katherine made her way to the address, indicated in Weston's letter, a shipping office near the waterfront. Inside, she found a busy operation with clerks moving between desks and sailors coming and going with cargo manifests. "I'm looking for James Morgan," Katherine told the receptionist, a young man with ink-stained fingers. "Your business?" The young man inquired, eyeing her travel-worn appearance with mild suspicion. Katherine produced the sealed letter. "I have correspondence from Weston Abernathy." The name produced an immediate reaction. The receptionist's eyebrows rose and he quickly stood. "One moment, please." He disappeared through a door at the back of the office, returning moments later with an older man. Tall and broad-shouldered, with gray threading his dark beard, James Morgan had the weathered look of someone who had spent years at sea before settling into business. "You have a letter from Weston?" he asked without preamble. Katherine nodded, handing him the sealed envelope. "I'm Katherine Zimmerman. This is my son, Jacob." Morgan studied her face for a moment before breaking the seal on the letter. His expression remained impassive as he read, though his eyebrows drew together briefly. "Come with me," he said when he finished reading, gesturing toward the door he had emerged from. "We need to talk privately." His office was spacious but utilitarian, with large windows overlooking the harbor. He offered Katherine a chair, then sat behind his desk, the letter still in his hand. "Weston says you're in danger, that I'm to provide you with accommodations and any assistance you need," Morgan said, getting straight to the point. "He doesn't explain much beyond that a man named Blackwood is the threat." "Howard Blackwood attacked the Triple Ranch while Weston was away on a cattle drive," Katherine explained, adjusting Jacob in her arms as he began to fuss. "He's been trying to take the land for years, apparently." Morgan nodded grimly. "Weston and I have been friends for a long time. He saved my life once when we were both much younger men. Whatever you need, you'll have." Relief washed over Katherine, the tension of the journey finally catching up with her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We just need a safe place to stay until I can contact Weston." "I have a house on Russian Hill," Morgan said, rising from his desk. "My sister keeps it for me, but there's plenty of room. You'll be comfortable there and safe." As they left the shipping office in Morgan's carriage, Katherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had made it to San Francisco, found Weston's friend, and secured safe haven. Now, all that remained was to wait for word from Texas to learn if Weston and Cecil had survived, if the ranch still stood, if there was anything left to return to. Morgan's house proved to be a handsome 3-story residence with views of the bay. His sister, Martha, a widow in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, welcomed Katherine and Jacob without prying questions, showing them to a comfortable bedroom with an adjoining nursery that had once belonged to Morgan's own children, now grown. "You rest," Martha insisted, seeing Katherine's exhaustion. "I've raised 4 children of my own. I can look after your little one while you sleep." Too tired to protest, Katherine accepted the offer gratefully. After settling Jacob with Martha, she collapsed onto the soft bed, falling into the first deep sleep she had enjoyed since fleeing the AAA. Days passed with no word from Texas. Katherine tried to settle into a routine at the Morgan house, helping Martha with household tasks and caring for Jacob, but her thoughts constantly returned to Weston. Had he returned to find his ranch destroyed? Was he searching for her? Or had Blackwood's men intercepted Cecil before he could deliver his warning? James Morgan used his shipping connections to inquire about news from the El Paso region, but information was slow to travel. All they learned was that there had indeed been some kind of conflict between ranches east of El Paso, but details were scarce. As the days turned into weeks, Katherine found herself drawn to the widow's walk atop the Morgan house. Each evening, she would stand there after Jacob was asleep, looking east toward the distant mountains and the land that lay beyond them, where Weston might even now be searching for her. It was on such an evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival in San Francisco, that Martha found her there, a telegram in hand. "James received this at his office," Martha said, holding out the paper. "It's from Texas." Katherine's heart raced as she took the telegram, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. Arriving San Francisco, stop Pacific Queen, stop November 10th, stop Abernathy. The message was brief, but it told her everything she needed to know. Weston was alive. He was coming to San Francisco. In just 3 days, the Pacific Queen would arrive, bringing him to her. Katherine pressed the telegram to her chest, tears of relief streaming down her face. Martha squeezed her shoulder gently, understanding without words the emotions overwhelming the younger woman. "I'll have James check the shipping schedules," Martha said. "We'll be there when the ship docks." The next 3 days were the longest of Katherine's life. She threw herself into preparations, washing and mending her best dress, trimming Jacob's fine baby hair, even baking bread in Martha's kitchen to keep her hands busy and her mind from constant worry. What would Weston say when he saw her? Would he be angry that she had fled? Relieved? And what of her growing feelings for him, feelings that had only strengthened during their separation? Katherine had no answers, only questions and the fluttering anticipation in her stomach whenever she thought of seeing him again. On the morning of November 10th, Katherine stood on the dock beside James and Martha Morgan, Jacob bundled warmly in her arms against the cool sea breeze. The Pacific Queen was visible in the distance, approaching the harbor with majestic slowness. "There she is," James said, pointing to the ship. "Should dock within the hour." Katherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She bounced Jacob gently, as much to soothe her own nerves as to keep him content. As the ship drew closer, Katherine scanned the deck for any sign of Weston, but the distance was too great to make out individual figures. It wasn't until the gangplank was lowered and passengers began to disembark that she finally saw him. He looked thinner than when she had last seen him, his face more weathered, but he was unmistakably Weston. He walked with a slight limp, suggesting an injury recently healed, and his eyes searched the crowd with an intensity that made Katherine's heart race. When his gaze finally found her, standing with Jacob at the edge of the dock, Weston stopped abruptly, as if struck. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the diminishing distance, the bustle of the harbor fading away around them. Then Weston was moving again, faster now, pushing past other disembarking passengers with single-minded purpose. Katherine handed Jacob to Martha and stepped forward, her own feet carrying her toward him without conscious thought. They met in the middle of the dock, stopping just short of touching, each drinking in the sight of the other after weeks of separation and uncertainty. "Katherine," Weston said, her name almost a prayer on his lips. "You're safe." "We both are," she confirmed, tears welling in her eyes. "Cecil got us away before. "I know," Weston interrupted gently. "Cecil found me in Fort Worth. We rode back together, but Blackwood had already done his damage." "The ranch?" Katherine asked, fearing the answer. "Standing," Weston replied, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Burned in places, but nothing that can't be rebuilt. Blackwood's men were driven off by the territorial marshal. It seems Blackwood's influence wasn't as strong as he believed." Relief flooded through Katherine, both for the ranch and for Cecil, who had apparently survived as well. And Blackwood? A shadow crossed Weston's face. Dead. He drew on the marshal when they came to arrest him. His ranch will be sold at auction to pay his debts. Katherine absorbed this news, feeling not joy but a solemn sense of justice served. Her attention returned to Weston, noticing again the limp, the way he held himself carefully as if nursing injuries. "You're hurt," she observed, her hand instinctively reaching toward him before dropping back to her side. "Nothing serious," Weston assured her. "Had a disagreement with one of Blackwood's men on the way back to the AAA. His eyes softened as he looked at her, a vulnerability in them she had never seen before. "I thought I might never see you again, when I found the ranch burning and you gone." "I followed your instructions," Katherine said. "The strong box, the letter to Mr. Morgan." Weston nodded. "You did exactly right, but knowing you were safe and seeing you standing here." He trailed off, seemingly unable to find words adequate to express his feelings. They might have stood there indefinitely, caught in the moment of reunion, if Jacob hadn't chosen that moment to let out a loud, demanding cry. Katherine turned automatically toward the sound, and Martha approached with the fussing infant. "I think someone wants his mother," Martha said with a knowing smile, handing Jacob to Katherine. As Katherine took her son, soothing him with practiced ease, she became acutely aware of Weston watching them, his expression a mixture of tenderness and something deeper, more profound. "He's grown," Weston observed softly, reaching out to touch Jacob's small hand. The baby immediately grabbed his finger, just as he had done the night before Weston left for the cattle drive. "Children do that," Katherine replied, smiling through tears she couldn't quite contain. "Even in a few weeks." Weston's eyes met hers over Jacob's head, and in that moment something shifted between them, a recognition of feelings too long unacknowledged. "I didn't come all this way just to check on your safety, Katherine," Weston said, his voice low and intense. "I came because I couldn't bear the thought of living without you and Jacob in my life." Katherine's breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. "Weston, let me finish," he insisted gently. "When I bought your freedom at that auction block, I never imagined how quickly you would come to mean everything to me. Your strength, your kindness, the way you brought life back to the AAA. He paused, gathering himself. "I love you, Katherine. I think I have since I first saw you holding Jacob, refusing to let anyone separate you from your son." The words Katherine had longed to hear, had hardly dared hope for, hung in the air between them. Joy bubbled up within her, threatening to overflow. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely. "I think I began falling in love with you the moment you helped me down from that auction block and told me I was free." Weston's face transformed with a smile unlike any Katherine had seen from him before, open, joyful, without reservation. He stepped closer, one hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "May I?" he asked, his intent clear in his eyes. Katherine nodded, and Weston leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with the promise of all they could be together. Jacob, caught between them, babbled happily, one small hand reaching up to pat Weston's chin. When they separated, both laughing softly at Jacob's intervention, James Morgan cleared his throat, reminding them of his and Martha's presence. "Perhaps we should continue this reunion at the house," he suggested with good-natured amusement. "I imagine you have much to discuss." In the carriage back to the Morgan residence, Katherine and Weston sat close together, Jacob dozing in Katherine's arms. As the city passed by outside the windows, Weston took Katherine's free hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Will you come back to Texas with me?" he asked quietly. "Help me rebuild the AAA, be my wife." Katherine looked up at him, seeing all her hopes for the future reflected in his eyes. "Yes," she said simply. To all of it. Weston's smile was answer enough, his hand tightening around hers in a promise that needed no words. 2 months later, on a clear January day in 1874, Katherine stood on the porch of the rebuilt main house at the Triple Ranch, watching as Weston played with Jacob in the winter sunshine. At 9 months old, Jacob was beginning to pull himself up on furniture, eager to explore the world around him. Weston encouraged him patiently, his strong hands ready to catch the boy if he toppled. The ranch was coming back to life around them. The burned buildings had been rebuilt, the fences repaired, and new cattle acquired to replace those lost in Blackwood's attack. Cecil, recovered from injuries sustained during the conflict, had resumed his duties as foreman with undiminished vigor. Katherine touched the simple gold band on her finger, still new enough to feel strange sometimes. They had married in San Francisco before returning to Texas, a small ceremony with the Morgans as witnesses. James and Martha had promised to visit in the spring, curious to see the ranch they had heard so much about. Weston looked up, catching Katherine watching them. The smile he gave her still made her heart skip, even after these weeks as husband and wife. He whispered something to Jacob, who turned his head toward Katherine and waved enthusiastically. "What are you two plotting?" Katherine called, descending the porch steps to join them. "Man talk," Weston replied with mock seriousness. "Very important ranch business." "I see," Katherine said, playing along as she reached them. "And does this important business include washing up for supper? Because Cecil said it'll be ready soon." "What do you think, Jacob?" Weston asked the boy. "Should we listen to your mother?" Jacob's response was an enthusiastic "Ma, ma," followed by a string of happy babbling that made both adults laugh. As they walked back to the house together, Weston's arm around Katherine's waist and Jacob balanced on his hip, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the desperate mother on the auction block to the beloved wife and mistress of the Triple Ranch, it seemed almost like a dream. "What are you thinking about?" Weston asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About how close I came to never experiencing this," Katherine replied honestly. "If you hadn't been in El Paso that day, if you hadn't decided to intervene." Weston stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "But I was, and I did, and I thank God every day for it." He leaned down to kiss her gently. "You and Jacob are the best things that ever happened to me, Katherine Abernathy." "And you're the best thing that happened to us," she replied softly, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "Our savior, our protector, our home." As they continued toward the house, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land that was now truly theirs to share, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. The auction block that had once symbolized her greatest despair had ultimately led her to her greatest joy, a family, a home, and a love strong enough to overcome any challenge the frontier might bring. And in the years that followed, as the Triple Ranch prospered and their family grew with the addition of twin boys in 1875 and a daughter in 1878, Katherine and Weston would sometimes look back on that fateful day in El Paso and marvel at how the darkest moment of her life had become the beginning of their greatest happiness. For in saving Katherine and Jacob that day, Weston had also saved himself, finding in their love the peace and purpose he had sought since his troubled youth. They built a legacy together on the Texas plains, a testament to the healing power of love and the strength found in second chances. And though life on the frontier was never easy, Katherine never again found herself without hope or protection. The cowboy who had bought her freedom had given her so much more, a future bright with possibility, and a love that would endure all the seasons of their lives together.